Press did find out that you'd been married, and you said you'd forgotten. Had you really forgotten?
No, of course not.
She was one of the most fiercely independent women Hollywood ever produced. A woman who refused to play by the rules, refused to be packaged, refused to disappear quietly when the industry tried to push her out. And then she met a man who was married, deeply troubled, and entirely unable to give her the public life she deserved. She gave him 26 years anyway. This is Katharine Hepburn, the Spencer-Tracy affair that defined her life. The girl from Hartford. To understand what Katharine Hepburn brought to her relationship with Spencer Tracy and what made her willing to accept its terms, you have to understand where she came from and what she had already survived by the time they met. She was born on May 12, 1907, in Hartford, Connecticut, into a household that was, by the standards of that era, genuinely unusual. Her father, Dr. Thomas Hepburn, was a prominent Hartford surgeon and a progressive thinker who believed in vigorous outdoor exercise, direct conversation, and the full equality of his daughters with his sons. Her mother, Katharine Hepburn, was a suffragist and activist who campaigned for women's right to vote and the right to access birth control information, both deeply controversial positions in the early 20th century. The Hepburn children grew up attending political rallies, hearing frank discussions of social issues at the dinner table, and being expected to think for themselves. Katharine was a tomboy, almost from infancy. As a young girl, she insisted on cutting her hair short and being called Jimmy, not Katharine. She was athletic, direct, and possessed of a quality that adults in that era didn't quite know what to do with. She looked at people as though she was entirely unimpressed by whatever authority they were projecting and thought they might want to consider that before continuing. Then, when she was 13 years old, she found her older brother, Tom. He was 15. They were staying with relatives in New York, and on a quiet morning in April 1921, Katharine went to his room and found him dead. The official family story, which they maintained for the rest of their lives, was that it was a terrible accident, that he had been attempting a magic trick with a rope and something had gone tragically wrong. Whether that was the full story or a version of it designed to protect the family is something that was never publicly resolved. What is certain is that the death shattered the 13-year-old Katharine in ways she spent decades rebuilding from. She became, in the aftermath, the kind of person who simply does not show weakness in public. The armoring was genuine. She had learned, at an age when most children are still figuring out how the world works, that the world can take everything from you without warning, and that the only reliable response to that knowledge is to be ready for it. She adopted Tom's birth date as her own, celebrating her birthday on November 8th, his day, rather than her own May 12th, a private form of memorial she kept for years. She attended Bryn Mawr College, her mother's alma mater, graduated in 1928, and immediately set her sights on the theatre. She was, in the beginning, not obviously destined for greatness. Her voice was too high and too sharp for some directors. Her mannerisms were called strange. She was fired from productions, replaced by other actresses, told in so many ways that her quality of presence, the very thing that would eventually make her irreplaceable, was the problem. She came back from every one of those setbacks with the specific tenacity of someone who has already survived something worse. Her film debut came in 1932, and her second picture, A Bill of Divorcement with John Barrymore, established her immediately as a talent worth watching. The following year, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Morning Glory, the first of 4 Oscar wins that would eventually make her the most decorated performer in Academy history. And then she got married, and then she got divorced, and then she met Howard Hughes, and then she got called box office poison. and then she engineered one of the most remarkable comebacks in Hollywood history. All of that happened before Spencer Tracy. The price of independence. Katharine Hepburn married Ludlow Ogden Smith, a Philadelphia businessman and a genuinely decent man, in 1928 when she was 21 years old. The marriage was, by all later accounts, somewhat unusual from the start. She made him change his surname to Ogden so that she would not be known as Kate Smith, a name associated at the time with a popular radio singer. She used his social connections in her early career. And when she won her first Academy Award in 1934, she filed for divorce. She later said, with an honesty that was characteristic of her, that she had been an absolute pig with Luddy, that he was an angel and she had treated him poorly. It was not an excuse, it was a reckoning. She understood that she had used the marriage for what it offered and ended it when it was no longer serving her trajectory, and she did not flinch from saying so. What she wanted was her career, complete and entire. She wanted to be the first thing in her own life, and she understood quite clearly that marriage as it existed in that era required a woman to be the second thing. The two ambitions were incompatible, and she chose the one she could live with. Through the mid-1930s, she had a prominent relationship with Leland Hayward, a talent agent and producer who would go on to become one of the most powerful men in show business. They were well matched in energy and ambition, and for a time the relationship seemed to give her something she actually needed. Then Hayward married actress Maggie Sullivan in 1936, and Hepburn moved on. What followed was Howard Hughes, the aviation pioneer, film producer, and billionaire eccentric who pursued her with an intensity that matched her own. Hughes was himself a figure of radical independence, someone who operated entirely outside normal social conventions, who flew his own planes across transcontinental records, who owned studios and newspapers and airlines with the casual authority of someone who had never been told the word no. In some ways, he was the closest Hepburn ever came to someone whose scale of living matched her own. They were together for several years in the mid to late 1930s. He encouraged her professionally and was willing to use his resources on her behalf at a moment when she badly needed both. He bought the film rights to the Philadelphia story for $30,000 and handed them to her, a gesture of such strategic and personal significance that it shaped the entire next decade of her professional life. Both Hughes and Leland Hayward proposed marriage. She turned them both down. She was not willing to be someone's wife. She was willing to be her own person, and she understood, clearly and without illusion, that those two things could not coexist in the world as it then operated. But the industry was not willing to tolerate her on her own terms forever. In 1938, the Independent Theatre Owners of America took out a full-page advertisement in The Hollywood Reporter. The advertisement listed a series of major stars whose box office appeal, the theatre owners argued, had failed to justify their enormous salaries. The language was blunt and dismissive. The label they applied to Katharine Hepburn and to Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Joan Crawford, and several others was box office poison. It was a commercially grounded attack, but it had a personal dimension that everyone in Hollywood understood. These were women who were considered too difficult, too unconventional, too unwilling to perform the accessibility that the studio system required. Hepburn's recent films had underperformed at the box office, it was true. A string of period pictures and dramatic vehicles had failed to connect with audiences in the way that her earlier work had. But the label was also about who she was. She had declined interviews. She had walked past reporters in slacks and no makeup when the convention for actresses required full presentation at all public moments. She had been publicly called Catherine of Arrogance in the press for what was framed as contempt for the public that bought her tickets. RKO, her studio, responded to the Poison label by offering her a low-budget film at a dramatically reduced salary. She declined and bought out her contract instead. The industry expected her to disappear. She did not. She bought out her contract with RKO, returned to Connecticut, and began working with playwright Philip Barry on a vehicle that would be built specifically around her particular strengths. The play was called The Philadelphia Story, and Barry wrote the central character, Tracy Lord, a fiercely intelligent, high-handed socialite who has to confront the limits of her own rigid perfection, with Hepburn in every line. She forwent her salary in exchange for a percentage of the profits and a controlling interest in the production. The play opened on Broadway on March 28, 1939. It ran for 417 performances. Howard Hughes purchased the film rights for $30,000 and handed them to Hepburn, who then negotiated with MGM's Louis B. Mayer for their sale at a price of $250,000, with full creative approval over the director, screenwriter, and cast written into the deal. The Philadelphia Story opened as a film on December 26, 1940. It broke the box office record at Radio City Music Hall, earning $600,000 in 6 weeks. It received 6 Academy Award nominations. The New York Times declared that the woman they had called box office poison was simply not what the label had described. The comeback was total. Within 2 years, she would be on the set of a new MGM production called Woman of the Year. Her co-star was an actor she had never met, a man named Spencer Tracy. The man who would not be managed. Spencer Tracy was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on April 5, 1900, to a devout Irish Catholic family. His father, John Tracy, worked as a truck salesman. The religion of his upbringing was not merely a cultural backdrop. It was a framework that Tracy carried inside him for his entire life, and that shaped the decisions he made and couldn't make with an intensity that those around him sometimes found difficult to understand from the outside. He attended Marquette Academy as a young man and briefly enlisted in the Navy at the start of World War I, before returning to civilian life and eventually finding his way to theatre. He studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, where one of his classmates was Pat O'Brien, who remained a lifelong friend. He had spent years on stage in New York before making his way to Hollywood, where his particular quality, a naturalistic stillness, a way of listening on camera that made him seem more real than anyone else in the frame, was immediately recognized as something rare. He didn't act in the way that actors in that era were supposed to act. He resisted method acting throughout his career, preferring an approach that was almost its opposite. Simply be in the scene, listen to what the other actors are giving you, and respond honestly. His direction to younger actors, when he bothered to give any, was said to have been simply to know your lines and don't bump into the furniture. The apparent simplicity of what he did fooled a great many people who tried to replicate it and found they could not. By the time Katharine Hepburn met him on the set of Woman of the Year in 1941, Tracy was one of the most respected and decorated actors in Hollywood. He had won consecutive Academy Awards for Best Actor, for Captains Courageous in 1937 and Boys Town in 1938, the first actor in history to win back-to-back in that category. He was extraordinarily in demand. He was also, by that point, a severely troubled man. He had married actress Louise Treadwell in 1923, and the marriage had produced 2 children, a son, John, born in 1924, and a daughter, Susie, born in 1932. John Tracy was diagnosed as profoundly deaf in infancy, and Tracy's response to his son's deafness was rooted in his Catholic guilt in a way that made rational understanding of it very difficult. He believed, at some deep and inaccessible level, that his son's deafness was a punishment for his own sins. The guilt compounded over the years, driving him further from his family and deeper into the alcoholism that was already beginning to reshape his professional life. He and Louise had become effectively estranged by the early 1930s, though they never separated formally and never divorced. Tracy was what clinicians would later identify as a binge drinker, someone who could go weeks or months without alcohol and then disappear into a drinking episode of extraordinary severity, lasting days, occasionally requiring hospitalization. The studio maintained what amounted to an on-call emergency protocol for Tracy's episodes, keeping an ambulance available and his more dramatic collapses out of the public eye with a combination of careful management, studio discretion, and the general complicity of a press corps that still considered celebrities' private lives largely off-limits. His alcoholism was understood as a professional liability and managed accordingly, but it was also, for those close to him, a source of ongoing fear. He had had affairs before Hepburn came into his life, with Loretta Young, with Joan Crawford, with Ingrid Bergman. None of them had become the permanent entanglement that the relationship with Hepburn would become. By the time he met her, he and Louise had been living separately for years, though they had never divorced, and, in Tracy's understanding of his own Catholic conscience, never would. The first meeting between Tracy and Hepburn has passed into Hollywood legend. Hepburn was wearing heels that made her taller than Tracy, and she reportedly offered the observation that she feared she was a bit too tall for him. Producer Joseph L. Mankiewicz provided the punchline, suggesting that Tracy would cut her down to size. Hepburn later said she knew right away she found him irresistible. They were initially somewhat cool with each other during the first days of production on Woman of the Year. Within a week, they were calling each other Spence and Kate. The film was a comedy drama about two journalists, a sharp-tongued sports writer and an internationally celebrated political correspondent, who fall in love and try to negotiate the competing demands of their careers and their relationship. The parallels to what the two actors were about to navigate in their actual lives were not subtle, and the people who made the film certainly noticed. Woman of the Year was released in February 1942 to enormous commercial and critical success. It earned 2 Academy Award nominations, including one for the original screenplay. MGM immediately began planning their next project together, and what the two actors had already begun between them stayed private, almost incomprehensibly private for two of the most famous people on Earth, for 26 years. The terms of the arrangement. The relationship between Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy was an open secret in Hollywood from essentially the beginning. The studio knew. The press knew. Their mutual friends knew. Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart socialized with them as a couple. Director George Cukor, who worked with both of them repeatedly, understood the situation completely. Even Louise Tracy, according to most accounts, was aware of the arrangement, though all three of them operated under a kind of collective understanding that required a particular form of discretion from everyone involved. The gossip columnists of the era, who had destroyed other careers with far less material, simply didn't write about it, whether out of genuine respect for the parties involved, out of studio pressure, or out of the calculation that a story with no official acknowledgement from either party could not be published without legal risk. Tracy would spend weekends with his family and weekdays with Hepburn. They maintained separate residences. He never publicly acknowledged the relationship. He never said her name in the context of their romantic involvement in any interview or public context. The silence was total, and it held for 26 years. Those outside the relationship sometimes found the arrangement difficult to explain from Hepburn's direction. Here was a woman who had refused to become anyone's conventional wife, who had turned down Howard Hughes and Leland Hayward, who had structured her entire adult life around the primacy of her own career and her own independence, now spending 26 years as the effectively invisible partner of a married man who would never introduce her as his own. Her explanation, offered in pieces across decades of interviews and in her 1991 autobiography, was simple and genuine. She loved him. She wrote that she would have done anything for him, that he and his interests and his needs came first, that it was a unique feeling she had for no one else. Lauren Bacall wrote that Hepburn was blindingly in love with Tracy, that the word applied in its most literal sense. Hepburn's nephew Mundy described how meeting Tracy had changed her, that she came in at the top of her game, with that fierce determination and sheer force of will that defined her, and that the relationship altered something in how she moved through her own life. What the relationship actually looked like in practice was, by all accounts, a combination of extraordinary tenderness and considerable difficulty. Hepburn cooked for him. She managed the practical details of his daily existence. On film sets, she was famously described as a mother hen, bringing Tracy pills for his ulcer, fetching coffee, sitting at his feet and looking up at him with an adoration that some observers found incongruous given who she was, praising him to other people in a manner quite unlike the fierce equality she projected in every other area of her life. Gene Kelly, who observed them at the studio, described a particular ritual. At lunchtime, they would find a bench somewhere on the lot and just sit together, holding hands and talking quietly. And everyone around them understood, without being told, that this was private time and that they should go find somewhere else to be. But Tracy, when he was drinking, was not the man he was otherwise. He could be verbally cruel. He could explode in ways that frightened people who witnessed it. He threw chairs through restaurant windows on more than one occasion. He was arrested for his behavior while intoxicated. Hepburn later acknowledged, without much elaboration, that he had hit her once during an episode. She did not frame this as something that defined the relationship. She framed it in the context of the illness that produced it. But she also did not pretend it hadn't happened. He also had other romantic involvements during their relationship. His connection with Ingrid Bergman was one that Hepburn knew about, and she was said to have maintained a lasting antipathy for Bergman as a result. She loved him through the knowledge of those other women, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided what they want and is not willing to revise the decision based on the evidence. Tracy never left Louise. The explanation that circulated most commonly was that as a devout Catholic, he could not divorce, that his faith made it impossible. Tracy himself reportedly told a friend that he could get a divorce whenever he wanted, but that his wife and Kate both liked things exactly as they were. Whatever the precise truth of his motivations, whether it was Catholic conviction, genuine concern for Louise, the particular guilt about his son's deafness that he never entirely worked through, or something more complicated than any of those explanations, the marriage to Louise remained formally intact until Tracy's death. A study of the arrangement that tried to be fair to everyone involved would probably conclude that no one had what they needed from it, and that all three people managed to live within it because the alternative, the destruction of multiple lives through public scandal, seemed worse. Louise had her husband's name and his financial support. Tracy had the relationship he actually lived. Hepburn had the man she loved, on the terms she could get him. Whether those were the terms she would have chosen if she had been the one setting them, only she knew. She claimed, consistently and for the rest of her life, that she had no interest in the legal structure of marriage, that what they had was sufficient. And she claimed it convincingly enough that the people who knew her tended to believe her. The films and the private world. The 9 films that Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy made together between 1942 and 1967 were some of the most commercially successful and critically admired of either career. Woman of the Year in 1942 established the template: 2 forceful personalities in a battle of wills that resolved into something warmer. And the films that followed refined and varied it in ways that kept audiences coming back for more of whatever it was those 2 particular people generated when they occupied the same frame. Keeper of the Flame in 1942 was a darker political thriller, quite different in tone. State of the Union in 1948 was a sharp political comedy in which they played a politician and his estranged wife navigating an election campaign. Adam's Rib in 1949, directed by George Cukor, who had known Hepburn since A Bill of Divorcement in 1932 and who directed more of her films than anyone else, was perhaps the finest of the comedies, a battle of the sexes courtroom drama whose wit and genuine equality between the 2 characters made it feel ahead of its time. Audiences watching Adam's Rib consistently reported the feeling that they were observing a real couple having a real argument, which was, in a sense, not entirely wrong. Pat and Mike in 1952, written specifically for them by Garson Kanin and Ruth Gordon, was Hepburn's personal favourite of the 9. Between those films, she continued to build a career of her own that had nothing to do with Tracy and everything to do with her own formidable talent. She made The African Queen in 1951 with Humphrey Bogart, requiring her to spend months on location in Uganda and the Belgian Congo under genuinely difficult physical conditions. Tracy had objections to her going. She went anyway. The film earned her an Academy Award nomination and is now regarded as one of the great films of that era. She made Summertime in Venice in 1955, Long Day's Journey into Night in 1962, a harrowing adaptation of Eugene O'Neill's autobiographical play that earned her an Academy Award nomination for what many considered her finest dramatic work. The Lion in Winter in 1968, with Peter O'Toole, would bring her another Academy Award. Throughout all of it, she maintained the discipline and the range of someone who had been fighting for the right to do serious work since her 20s. But the Tracy relationship was the organizing fact of her private life. She structured her years around his needs, his episodes, his health crises. He was hospitalized for his drinking on multiple occasions, and Hepburn managed those hospitalizations with the logistics of someone who has accepted caregiving as part of their permanent responsibilities. In 1963, Tracy collapsed from pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, a serious medical crisis. In 1965, he underwent prostate surgery. By this period, he had also developed significant heart disease and diabetes. Throughout his declining years, Hepburn was consistently present in ways that no studio publicist acknowledged and no newspaper reported. She had essentially stepped into the role of his primary caregiver, and she did it without complaint and without credit. The last 2 years of Tracy's life, by Hepburn's own description, were spent quietly in his small Beverly Hills apartment, reading together, painting, listening to music. She described those evenings as their oasis. Whatever the world around them required them to be, in that apartment they were simply themselves. 2 people who had been together for 2 decades and who had learned, with the patience that only comes from long familiarity, the specific rhythms of each other's days. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? The Last Act. By 1966, Spencer Tracy was 66 years old and visibly dying. He had heart disease, diabetes, and the accumulated damage of decades of heavy drinking. He had made very few films in recent years. His declining health had forced him to withdraw from several commitments that other actors had taken in his place. Director Stanley Kramer, who had worked with Tracy repeatedly and understood both his gifts and his limitations, came to Hepburn with a proposal for one final film. The project was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a drama about a liberal white couple whose values are put to the test when their daughter brings home a black fiancé. The politics of the film were urgent. It would be released in 1967, a period of enormous civil rights tension in America. But what drove Hepburn to push for it was something more immediate: the chance to make one more film with Tracy before he was gone. The insurance problem was severe. Tracy was so obviously unwell that no insurance company would cover the risk of his dying during production, leaving the studio exposed. Hepburn's solution was characteristically direct. She put her own salary in escrow as a guarantee against Tracy completing his scenes. She refused to do the film without him. Stanley Kramer, recognizing both the creative and personal stakes, agreed to do the same. Tracy could work only 2 to 3 hours each day. The production was organized around his capacity. When he was well enough to film, everyone gathered quickly and captured what they could. When he was not, they waited. The crew was described as existing in a state of collective tenderness around him, aware, as everyone was, that this was the end of something, and that the man in front of the camera was giving what remained of himself to the work. The final scene that Tracy filmed was his character's climactic speech, a long, heartfelt monologue in which Matthew Drayton reconciles himself to his daughter's interracial engagement and reflects on what love means when it's truly real. It was the last piece of acting Spencer Tracy ever did. The film crew gave him a standing ovation when the scene was complete. Hepburn, in the background of the shot, was crying. People who were present said her tears were not acting. She knew what was happening. She had known for some time. Tracy completed his last scene on May 24th, 1967. On June 10th, 1967, early in the morning, Tracy got up with the insomnia that had plagued him for years and went to the kitchen to make himself a cup of tea. Hepburn heard him moving, then heard the sound of a cup smashing on the floor, and then a heavy thud. She entered the kitchen and found him on the floor. He was dead of a heart attack. He was 67 years old. They had been together for 26 years. The studio's publicist told the press that Tracy had been found by his housekeeper, alone. Hepburn's presence in the apartment and her role in those final hours was not mentioned. She had learned, over 26 years, that this was how it worked. She did not attend his funeral. She followed the hearse to the church in her car, sat outside while the service proceeded, and watched as they took the coffin out of the mortuary and put it into the hearse. It was not because she had ceased to love him. It was because Louise Tracy was inside, and the women who had shaped Spencer Tracy's life had always, in the end, required of Hepburn a particular kind of self-effacement that she gave without being asked. She later wrote, in her autobiography, that he had looked happy, as though dying had released him from a burden he had carried for too long. That was the most honest thing she said about all of it. The long silence, and then the truth. For 16 years after Spencer Tracy died, Katharine Hepburn did not speak publicly about their relationship. She went back to work almost immediately, making The Lion in Winter in 1968, which paired her with Peter O'Toole in a brilliantly savage portrait of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and for which she won her second Academy Award for Best Actress. When it was announced that she had won, she did not attend the ceremony. She almost never attended. She had attended the Academy Awards exactly once in her entire career, in 1974, when she went to present a Lifetime Achievement Award to another filmmaker and not to receive anything herself. The avoidance of public ceremony was characteristic, and it kept her at a useful distance from the industry's need to possess her. She made Rooster Cogburn in 1975 with John Wayne, an unlikely but genuinely affectionate pairing that played on both their legends. She made On Golden Pond in 1981 alongside Henry Fonda, a film about aging and reconciliation between an estranged father and daughter that became a genuine cultural event, partly because both Hepburn and Fonda were so obviously reaching the end of their own long careers, and the film acknowledged that plainly. She won her fourth Academy Award for Best Actress for the performance. Fonda, who was dying during production, won Best Actor. The film had the quality of something real happening on screen, rather than something being performed. She worked on Broadway in Lillian Hellman's The Little Foxes in 1981, and then in a stage production of Noel Coward's Private Lives with Richard Burton in 1983, a reunion of sorts with the man who had shared the most complicated romantic history of her generation with another actress, and whose own declining health gave the tour a certain Twilight character. It was only after the death of Louise Tracy in 1983, the woman who had been Spencer Tracy's wife for the entirety of their relationship, that Hepburn began, gradually, to open the door on what her own life had actually contained. She had befriended Tracy's daughter Susie and felt that the time for silence had passed. She also understood, at 76, that the silence could not hold much longer in any case. The interviews she gave in subsequent years were the most personally revealing of her career, and they were still, characteristically, entirely on her own terms. In 1986, she sat before a television camera and read aloud a letter she had written to Spencer Tracy. The broadcast reached millions of people. She had kept the letter for years, written it for herself and for him, and not for any audience, and she chose when to share it and how much to share. Those who watched described the experience as unusual. A woman in her late 70s, every word deliberate, every pause intentional, still managing even the most public possible moment of vulnerability with complete control. In her 1991 autobiography, Me, Stories of My Life, she gave the clearest statement she would ever make of what the relationship had been. She loved him. She would have done anything for him. He and his interests and his demands came first. She described it without self-pity and without grievance. It was what it was, and she was not sorry. She also said, in an interview about why she had stayed in a relationship on those terms for 26 years, that she honestly didn't know, that she could only say she could never have left him, that what they had was, to her, absolute bliss. She outlived Tracy by 36 years. She died on June 29, 2003, at her home in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, the family home she had loved her whole life, the house by Long Island Sound that had been the center of the Hepburn family's world since before she was born. She was 96 years old. She holds records that may never be broken. 4 Academy Awards for Best Actress out of 12 nominations. She was ranked 7th on the American Film Institute's list of the greatest female screen legends. She made films across 6 decades. She never remarried. She never stopped being who she had decided to be at 13 years old, standing in the wreckage of her brother's death and building herself into something that could survive whatever came. She never watched Guess Who's Coming to Dinner after Tracy died. She tried once and found she could not. The memories of filming it, of knowing it was the last thing they would ever do together, of watching him give what remained of his physical strength to a final performance that he understood was his farewell. She could not revisit any of it through a cinema screen. She never watched it again. What she had with Spencer Tracy was not what she would have designed if she had been designing it. It was not equal. It was not publicly acknowledged. It gave her a grief she carried for 36 years without the social permission that a widow receives, without a seat at the funeral, without a name on the obituary. without any formal recognition that the person who had just died had been, in any meaningful sense, hers. And she described it, in the most honest moment of a very long life of carefully managed public expression, as absolute bliss. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.